This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The Appalachian Mountains stretch across 13 states, a vast and ancient chain of peaks that predate most life on Earth. These mountains have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, absorbed countless stories, and harbored secrets in their endless hollows and ridges. Most people who visit the region see only the surface, the scenic overlooks, the tourist towns, the folklore museums selling sanitized versions of mountain culture. But there are places in these mountains that tourists never find, communities that exist in pockets of isolation so profound that they might as well be on another planet. This is a story about one such place and about what happens when isolation becomes something more than just geographic distance. In the fall of 1974, a research team from the University of Virginia received funding to conduct an anthropological study of isolated communities in the southern Appalachian region. The project was led by Dr. Merrick Ashwood, a cultural anthropologist who had spent the previous decade documenting disappearing ways of life throughout rural America. His team consisted of 3 graduate students and a documentary filmmaker named Dalton Cross. Their goal was simple: to record the oral histories, traditions, and daily lives of communities that had minimal contact with the outside world. The project was scheduled to last 18 months, covering multiple sites across Virginia, West Virginia, and eastern Kentucky. The first 3 months proceeded without incident. The team visited several remote communities, conducting interviews and filming daily activities. The residents were generally cooperative, if somewhat reserved. Mountain people have always been cautious with outsiders, but the team learned to build trust slowly, respecting boundaries and observing more than they questioned. Dr. Ashwood was particularly skilled at this approach, having spent years developing relationships with isolated groups. He understood that time moved differently in these places, that patience was not just a virtue, but a necessity. In late January 1975, the team received information about a settlement in the high country of eastern Kentucky, a place that locals in the nearest town referred to only as the Vesper community. The name came from the hollow where it was located, though no one seemed to know the origin of that name. What made Vesper interesting to the research team was not just its isolation, which was extreme even by mountain standards, but the fact that people in surrounding areas spoke about it in hushed tones, if they spoke about it at all. When asked directly about Vesper, most would simply say they did not know much about it or would change the subject. This kind of silence was unusual. Mountain communities might be private, but they were rarely mysterious to their neighbors. Dr. Ashwood decided that Vesper would be their next research site. It took nearly 2 weeks to arrange access. The settlement had no telephone lines, no postal service, and no regular contact with the outside world. The nearest town, a place called Harlan Junction, was 17 miles away by road, but that road became impassable for much of the winter and spring. Eventually, through a series of intermediaries, Dr. Ashwood made contact with someone who agreed to guide them into the hollow. The guide, a man named Silas Thorne, lived on the outskirts of Harlan Junction and occasionally traded with people from Vesper. He was in his 60s, weathered and taciturn, and he made it clear that he would take them in only once. After that, they would need to find their own way out. The journey into Vesper Hollow took most of a day, following narrow trails that switchbacked up steep ridges and descended into densely forested valleys. The trees in this part of the mountains were old growth, towering hemlocks and oaks that blocked out most of the sunlight even in winter. The silence was profound. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, just the sound of their own breathing and the crunch of frozen leaves underfoot. Dalton Cross, the filmmaker, later described it as the most oppressive silence he had ever experienced, a quiet that seemed to press against his eardrums like physical weight. They arrived at Vesper just before dusk. The settlement consisted of perhaps 20 structures scattered across a narrow valley where a small creek ran between steep ridges. The buildings were old, constructed in a style that seemed to predate the 20th century. Log cabins with stone chimneys, a few larger structures that might have been communal buildings, everything built close to the ground as if trying to avoid notice. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and there were signs of recent activity, but no people were visible. Silas Thorne led them to the largest building, what appeared to be a meeting house, and knocked on the door. They waited for what felt like a long time before the door opened. The man who answered was younger than Dr. Ashwood had expected, perhaps in his late 30s, tall and lean with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at them. He introduced himself as Gareth, said nothing about a last name, and invited them inside. The interior of the building was dim, lit only by a fire in a large stone hearth. A few other people sat on benches along the walls, watching the newcomers with expressions that were neither hostile nor welcoming, simply watchful. Gareth listened as Dr. Ashwood explained their project, nodding occasionally but asking no questions. When the explanation was finished, Gareth was silent for a long moment before speaking. He told them they could stay for 6 weeks, no longer. They could conduct their interviews and make their recordings, but there were rules. They were not to wander alone. They were not to enter any building without invitation. They were not to go into the woods after dark. And they were not to ask about certain things. When Dr. Ashwood asked what things, Gareth simply said they would know when they reached those boundaries. The team agreed to the conditions. They had encountered similar restrictions in other isolated communities, though usually the prohibitions were more specific. Here the vagueness felt deliberate, as if the restrictions themselves were a test. Silas Thorne left the next morning, heading back down the mountain alone. The research team set up their equipment in a small cabin that Gareth said they could use. Over the next few days, they began the slow process of integrating into the community's daily rhythm. Vesper operated on patterns that seemed ancient, activities dictated by sunlight and season rather than clocks or calendars. People rose before dawn and were asleep soon after dark. They worked constantly, tending small gardens, maintaining their buildings, processing wood and water and food in ways that required enormous physical labor. There was no electricity, no running water, no modern conveniences of any kind. The community was entirely self-sufficient, producing everything they needed from the resources of the hollow. The residents were polite but distant. They answered questions in brief, factual terms, offering no elaboration or personal opinion. They allowed themselves to be filmed, but their movements in front of the camera were stiff and self-conscious. Dr. Ashwood noted in his field journal that the people of Vesper seemed to be performing a role, presenting a version of themselves rather than revealing who they actually were. This was not unusual in the early stages of fieldwork, but what struck him was the consistency of it. In most communities, there were always a few individuals who were more open, more curious about the outsiders, more willing to engage beyond the surface level. In Vesper, everyone maintained the same careful distance. After about a week, patterns began to emerge that troubled the research team. The community had no children. This in itself was not impossible. Isolated groups sometimes had low birth rates, but the absence was so complete that it felt deliberate. There were no toys, no small clothes hanging on lines, no sounds of young voices. Everyone in Vesper appeared to be between 30 and 60 years old, though it was hard to tell with certainty. The residents had a weathered quality that made age difficult to determine. When one of the graduate students, a young woman named Lucinda Hayes, carefully asked about families, about children, she was met with silence. The question was not refused, it was simply not answered, as if she had asked about something that did not exist. The second troubling pattern was the schedule the community kept. The strict adherence to daylight hours was absolute. As the sun began to set, people would stop whatever they were doing and retreat to their homes. Doors would close, shutters would be drawn, fires would be banked. By full dark, the settlement was completely silent and apparently empty. The research team, staying in their assigned cabin, could see no lights, hear no sounds. It was as if the entire community simply ceased to exist after sunset. This continued every night without variation. When Dr. Ashwood asked Gareth about it, about why people stayed inside after dark, Gareth said simply that it was their way, that it had always been their way. The third pattern was more subtle, but perhaps the most disturbing. The residents of Vesper would occasionally stop what they were doing and look toward the tree line, toward the dense forest that surrounded the hollow on all sides. These moments were brief, a pause in conversation or work, a slight turning of the head, eyes focusing on something in the shadows between the trees. Then they would resume their activity as if nothing had happened. The research team noticed this behavior within the first few days, but it became more frequent as time went on. Dr. Ashwood tried to follow their gaze to see what they were looking at, but he could never identify anything unusual. Just trees and shadows in the deep quiet of the winter forest. Dalton Cross, the filmmaker, was the first to sense that something was fundamentally wrong. He had spent years documenting remote communities, had developed an instinct for reading the unspoken dynamics of isolated groups. Vesper felt different. There was a tension beneath the surface, a current of fear that ran through every interaction. People moved carefully, spoke carefully, existed carefully, as if any deviation from established patterns might trigger some terrible consequence. He mentioned this to Dr. Ashwood, who acknowledged the observation but suggested they needed more time to understand the community's dynamics. Fear, Dr. Ashwood noted, was not uncommon in isolated groups. Years of hardship, of living on the edge of survival, could create a kind of collective anxiety that became woven into the culture itself. But as the second week progressed, even Dr. Ashwood began to feel that something was not right. The interviews he conducted were stilted and strange. People would answer questions about their daily lives, about how they grew their food or built their shelters. But whenever the conversation veered toward history, toward how the community came to be or how long people had lived there, responses became vague and contradictory. One person would say the settlement was over 100 years old. Another would suggest it was much younger. No one could or would explain how they had come to live in such isolation, why they had chosen this particular hollow, why they maintained such strict separation from the outside world. One afternoon, while interviewing an older woman named Morwenna, Dr. Ashwood asked about the name Vesper, about what it meant and where it came from. Morwenna was silent for a long time, her hands still in her lap, her eyes fixed on something beyond the window. Finally, she said that Vesper meant evening, the time between day and night. She said it was chosen because this place existed in that space, between one thing and another, neither fully part of the world below nor completely separate from it. Then she said something that Dr. Ashwood wrote down exactly in his notes. "We are kept here, and we keep something else here, and that is the arrangement that allows both to exist." When he asked what she meant, Morwenna stood up and walked out of the room. She did not return, and when Dr. Ashwood sought her out later, she behaved as if the conversation had never happened. This kind of abrupt termination happened several more times over the following days. People would begin to speak about something that seemed important, and then would suddenly stop, stand up, and leave. It was as if there were invisible lines that could not be crossed, boundaries that existed only in the minds of the residents, but were absolutely real to them. The graduate students began to notice other oddities. The food in Vesper was simple, but adequate, mostly preserved vegetables and cured meat, but no one ever saw anyone hunting. There was no livestock, no chickens or pigs or cattle. When asked where the meat came from, residents would say it was traded, but they never specified with whom or how. The community had a small cemetery on the ridge above the hollow, but the graves there were old, decades old at minimum, with no recent burials. Either no one in Vesper had died in recent years, which seemed unlikely given the harsh conditions, or the dead were disposed of in some other way that was not discussed. Lucinda Hayes, who had training in psychology as well as anthropology, suggested that the community might be operating under some form of shared delusion, a collective belief system that shaped their behavior in ways they themselves might not fully understand. Isolated groups could develop unique psychological patterns, especially when cut off from outside influence for extended periods. What seemed strange or irrational to outsiders might be completely logical within the internal framework of the community. Dr. Ashwood considered this possibility, but noted that the residents of Vesper did not seem delusional in any clinical sense. They were coherent, rational, capable of complex tasks and social interactions. Their strangeness was not in their thinking, but in their behavior, in the things they did and did not do, the subjects they would and would not discuss. By the third week, the strain of staying in Vesper was beginning to affect the research team. The isolation, the constant sense of being watched, the oppressive silence after dark, all of it wore on their nerves in ways that surprised them. They were experienced researchers, accustomed to difficult field conditions, but Vesper felt different. Dalton Cross stopped sleeping well, claimed he heard sounds outside their cabin at night, movement in the darkness, voices too far away to make out words. The others dismissed this at first, chalked it up to stress and unfamiliar surroundings, but then they began to hear things too, not every night, but often enough that it became impossible to ignore. The sounds were difficult to describe. Sometimes it was footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Sometimes it was scratching, as if something with claws was testing the walls. Sometimes it was breathing, deep and rhythmic, just outside the door. The team never opened the door at night to investigate. They had been warned not to, and something in the quality of those sounds made them reluctant to break that rule. In the morning, they would search for tracks or signs of whatever had been there, but they found nothing. The ground around the cabin showed no disturbance, no marks of any kind. It was as if the sounds existed without a physical source. Dr. Ashwood began to ask more direct questions. He approached Gareth one morning and asked plainly what was in the woods, what the community was so careful to avoid after dark. Gareth looked at him for a long time before answering. He said that the woods were old, older than human memory, and that old places accumulated things, drew things to them. He said that the people of Vesper had learned to coexist with what was here, that coexistence required certain behaviors, certain sacrifices. When Dr. Ashwood pressed for specifics, Gareth said only that some knowledge was dangerous, that knowing too much could change a person in ways they could not undo. This kind of cryptic response was frustrating, but Dr. Ashwood recognized it as a defense mechanism. Communities with strong oral traditions often guarded their core beliefs, sharing them only with members who had proven themselves trustworthy over long periods. The research team had been in Vesper less than a month. They were still outsiders, still untested, but the lack of clarity was making it difficult to conduct meaningful research. They had recordings and interviews, but everything felt surface level, a performance rather than an authentic glimpse into the community's life. Then something happened that changed the nature of their stay. It was late afternoon, still an hour before sunset, when one of the residents, a man named Calix who rarely spoke, approached the research team's cabin. He seemed agitated, kept looking back over his shoulder toward the tree line. He asked to speak with Dr. Ashwood privately. The two of them walked a short distance from the cabin, and Calix began to talk in a low, urgent voice. He said that the others did not want him sharing this information, that there would be consequences if they found out, but he felt the research team needed to understand what they were documenting, needed to know what they were really looking at when they studied Vesper. Calix explained that the community had not always been isolated by choice. Generations ago, the people who would become Vesper had been part of a larger settlement lower in the mountains. There had been an incident, something that happened in the late 1800s, details of which had been lost or deliberately obscured over time. Whatever occurred forced a group of families to flee into the high country, to these remote hollows where pursuit would be difficult. They established themselves here, built their settlement, learned to survive. But in doing so, they entered into territory that was already occupied, not by other people, but by something else, something that had lived in these mountains long before humans arrived. The arrangement that Morwenna had mentioned, the keeping and being kept, referred to this coexistence. The community stayed in the hollow, followed certain rules, maintained certain behaviors, and in return, they were allowed to exist here. What they were coexisting with, Calix called it, by a name that Dr. Ashwood had heard before, a term from indigenous traditions of the region, skinwalker. But Calix insisted that the word was not quite right, that it was the closest English approximation to something that had no proper name, something that existed in the spaces between human understanding. It was not one thing, but many. It lived in the forest, moved through the trees at night, watched them constantly. It could mimic, could take on appearances, could make itself seem like something it was not. Dr. Ashwood asked what Calix meant by this, whether he was speaking literally or metaphorically. Calix said that the distinction did not matter, that what people called real and what they called unreal were the same thing in these mountains. The entity, the presence, whatever it was, had been here for longer than anyone could remember. It predated the community, predated probably all human presence in the region. The people of Vesper had learned through trial and error what behaviors kept them safe, what actions would bring attention, what rules could not be broken. The strict schedule, the confinement after dark, the prohibition on wandering alone, all of it was designed to minimize contact, to maintain a fragile balance. But the balance was failing. That was why Calix was speaking now, despite the risks. In recent years, the presence had become more active, more aggressive. People had begun to disappear. Not many, one every few years, but always under circumstances that were impossible to explain. Someone would be working in their garden at dusk, would not come inside when expected, would never be seen again. Or someone would go to the communal well in early morning, before the sun was fully up, and simply not return. The community would search, would call out, but they would find nothing. No body, no signs of struggle, no trace. And they could not leave. Attempts to abandon Vesper always ended the same way. People who tried to flee would make it a few miles down the mountain and then turn back, compelled by something they could not resist, drawn back to the hollow like moths to flame. Dr. Ashwood listened to all of this with growing concern. What Calix was describing sounded like a community in severe psychological distress, operating under a shared delusion that had hardened into absolute belief. The disappearances could be accounted for through accidents in difficult terrain, bodies lost in the dense forest. Natural explanations that fear and isolation had transformed into something supernatural. But Calix seemed so sincere, so afraid, that it was difficult to dismiss his account entirely. Dr. Ashwood thanked him for sharing this information, assured him it would be treated confidentially, and suggested they speak more in the coming days. That night, the sounds outside the cabin were worse than ever. Not just footsteps and breathing, but voices, words that almost made sense, but were distorted, twisted. The team stayed awake until dawn, huddled around their small stove, saying nothing, trying not to show their fear. When morning came and they emerged from the cabin, They found that every door in the settlement was open, not damaged, not broken, just open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. The residents were gathered in the center of the hollow, standing in a loose circle, all facing outward toward the trees. No one spoke. No one moved. The research team approached slowly, and Gareth turned to look at them with an expression of such profound resignation that Dr. Ashwood felt his stomach drop. Gareth said that the presence was displeased. The outsiders had brought change, had asked questions that should not be asked, had stirred up things that were meant to stay quiet. The 6 weeks they had been promised was being revoked. They needed to leave immediately before dark. The team did not argue. They packed their equipment as quickly as possible, gathered their notes and recordings, prepared to make the long hike back to Harlan Junction. But before they left, Dr. Ashwood asked Gareth one final question. He asked what would happen to Vesper, to the people who lived here. Gareth said that they would continue as they had always continued, that this was their place, and they had no choice but to remain, that the arrangement would hold as long as they maintained their part of it. The journey out of the hollow took longer than the journey in. The trail seemed different, harder to follow, as if the landscape itself had shifted. Dalton Cross, walking near the back of the group, claimed he saw figures moving parallel to them through the trees, keeping pace but staying just out of clear view. The others saw nothing, but they walked faster, driven by a shared urgency to put distance between themselves and Vesper. They reached Harlan Junction after dark, exhausted and shaken. Silas Thorne, the guide who had taken them in, was waiting at his small house on the edge of town. He looked at them and simply nodded, as if their early return and obvious distress confirmed something he had already known. Dr. Ashwood tried to report what they had experienced to local authorities, but he found no interest and considerable skepticism. The sheriff in Harlan Junction listened politely and then suggested that mountain communities could be strange to outsiders, that isolation did things to people, that the research team had likely misinterpreted cultural differences as something more sinister. When Dr. Ashwood mentioned the disappearances, the sheriff said there were no missing persons reports from that area, no records of anyone from Vesper ever making contact with outside authorities. How could people disappear, he asked, if no one reported them missing? It was a question Dr. Ashwood had no good answer for. The team returned to the University of Virginia and attempted to process their experience. The recordings they had made in Vesper were strange. Audio captured sounds that had not been audible at the time, voices in the background that no one remembered hearing, words and languages none of them recognized. Video footage had anomalies, brief moments of distortion, shadows that moved in ways that did not match any visible light source. These could be explained as technical glitches, equipment malfunctioning in the cold mountain environment, but the consistency of the anomalies made such explanations feel insufficient. Dr. Ashwood wrote a preliminary report, but he struggled to find a framework for what they had witnessed. The academic language of anthropology seemed inadequate to capture the experience. He returned to the mountains that summer, determined to make contact with Vesper again. He went alone this time, hired a different guide, hiked into the high country, following the routes he remembered. But when he reached the place where the hollow should have been, he found nothing. The valley was there. The creek was there, but the settlement was gone. No buildings, no cleared land, no signs that anyone had ever lived there. The forest was dense and undisturbed, as if the structures they had documented just months before had never existed. Dr. Ashwood searched for 2 days, covering every possible approach to the area, but he found no trace of Vesper. Even the cemetery on the ridge was gone, the ground showing no signs of burial or excavation. He made inquiries in Harlan Junction, asked about the community, about the people he had interviewed. No one would speak to him. Silas Thorne had disappeared, his house abandoned, neighbors claiming they had never known anyone by that name. The sheriff was new, a different person than the one Dr. Ashwood had spoken to just months before. And this sheriff insisted there had never been a settlement in that part of the mountains, that Dr. Ashwood must be confused about the location. Frustrated and disturbed, Dr. Ashwood returned to the university and attempted to reconstruct what had happened using the notes and recordings from his original visit. But the materials were changing. Transcripts of interviews would have different words when he read them again. Names would shift, details would alter, as if the act of documenting Vesper was somehow unstable, resistant to being fixed in any permanent form. Lucinda Hayes, the graduate student who had been part of the original team, suggested that perhaps they needed to accept that some experiences could not be captured, that attempting to record and analyze Vesper was itself a violation of whatever rules governed that place. Dr. Ashwood struggled with this idea. His entire career was built on the belief that human cultures could be studied, understood, preserved through careful documentation, the suggestion that some communities existed outside this framework, that some places operated under rules that made them fundamentally unknowable, challenged everything he had built his professional identity around. Over the following year, the members of the research team began to drift apart. Dalton Cross abandoned documentary work entirely, moved to a city, took a job that had nothing to do with film or research. The graduate students completed their degrees but chose different paths, different areas of study. Dr. Ashwood remained at the university, but stopped taking on fieldwork projects. He continued to write about Vesper, but every paper he submitted was rejected, criticized for lack of verifiable evidence, for relying too heavily on subjective interpretation. His descriptions were called fantastical, his conclusions labeled as speculation rather than research. The academic community, which had once respected his work, began to view him as someone who had lost his objectivity, who had allowed himself to become too immersed in the myths and fears of the people he was supposed to study dispassionately. In 1978, Dr. Ashwood received a letter. It had no return address, was postmarked from a small town in eastern Kentucky, not Harlan Junction, but somewhere nearby. The letter was handwritten on plain paper and consisted of a single paragraph. It said that Vesper still existed, that the community had not disappeared, but had simply moved, shifted deeper into the mountains, to a place even more isolated than before. It said that the presence they had coexisted with had become more demanding, that the balance was harder to maintain, that people were leaving less frequently now, unable or unwilling to risk what separation might bring. The letter was signed with the name Calyx. Dr. Ashwood never learned how to respond to it, could not track down the origin, and eventually filed it away with his other materials from the project. He retired from the university in 1985, moved to a small town in Virginia, far from the mountains. He continued to think about Vesper, about what he had seen and what it meant. In his later years, he developed a theory never published, never shared beyond a few trusted colleagues. He believed that certain places, particularly ancient places with long histories of human presence, accumulated something, not spirits, not ghosts, nothing so definable. Rather, they collected the fears and beliefs of everyone who had ever lived there, layer upon layer of human consciousness pressing down into the landscape like sediment-forming rock. In places where that accumulation reached a critical density, where isolation prevented it from dissipating into the larger culture, it could take on a kind of autonomy, could begin to shape the people who lived there, rather than being shaped by them. Vesper, in this theory, was a place where the accumulated weight of fear and belief had become so dense that it achieved something like sentience. The residents were not delusional. They were responding rationally to a real phenomenon, but the phenomenon itself was not supernatural. It was psychological, collective, a shared reality that existed because enough people believed in it strongly enough to make it manifest. The skinwalker, the presence, the entity in the woods was not a creature, but a consensus, a projection of the community's need for something to explain their isolation, their suffering, their inability to leave. And because they believed in it so completely, it became real, at least in the space of that hollow. But this theory had a disturbing implication. If belief could create reality in places like Vesper, if the accumulated fear of isolated communities could take on independent existence, then how many other places were there like this? How many remote hollows and hidden valleys contained communities living under rules that existed nowhere else, maintaining balances with things that should not exist? And what happened when those communities finally dissolved, when the last residents died or fled? Did the presence they had coexisted with simply fade away? Or did it remain, waiting for the next group of people to stumble into its territory and begin the cycle again? Dr. Ashwood never found answers to these questions. He died in 1992, and his research materials were donated to the university's archives. They sit there now, available to anyone who wants to examine them, but few do. The recordings are too corrupted to be useful, the notes too fragmentary and contradictory. The story of Vesper exists in a kind of limbo, neither confirmed nor debunked, neither real nor entirely imaginary. People who study isolated communities in Appalachia occasionally stumble across references to it, mention it in passing, but no one has ever been able to verify its existence or locate where it might have been. There are, however, persistent reports from hikers and hunters in the high country of eastern Kentucky, reports of stumbling across small settlements that seem abandoned but show signs of recent habitation. Fires still warm, food still fresh, doors standing open as if the residents had just stepped out for a moment and would return soon. These reports always describe the same feeling, a sense of being watched, of invisible eyes tracking every movement, of the forest around these places being somehow alert, somehow conscious. Most people who experience this leave quickly, driven by instincts they cannot quite explain. They emerge from the mountains and rarely speak about what they found, though some will admit in private conversations that they felt they were being allowed to leave, that permission had been granted, but could easily be revoked. The Forest Service has no records of permanent settlements in that region. Maps show only wilderness, unbroken forest with no signs of human habitation. But maps are made by people who have never walked every inch of ground they claim to represent. The Appalachian Mountains are vast, complex, full of places that exist in the gaps between official knowledge. And in those gaps, in the hollows and ridges that appear on no chart, communities continue to exist according to their own rules, their own arrangements, their own fragile balances with things that may or may not be there. In 2003, a journalist named Fiona Thane attempted to trace Dr. Ashwood's research to investigate whether Vesper had any basis in historical fact. She spent months in eastern Kentucky interviewing locals, examining land records, searching for any documentation of a settlement in the high country. She found nothing definitive, but she did encounter an unusual pattern. Several families in the region had oral histories of relatives who had gone into the mountains and never returned, disappearances that dated back generations. These stories were not told as mysteries or tragedies. They were told as if the disappearances were expected, even necessary, as if certain people were meant to go into the mountains and stay there. When Fiona asked why, she received vague answers about old obligations, about debts that had to be paid, about arrangements made long ago that still held binding power. She attempted to hire guides to take her into the high country, to explore the areas where Vesper might have been located. Every guide she approached refused. Some claimed the terrain was too dangerous. Others said they did not know the area well enough. But a few, after she had built some trust with them, admitted that there were places in those mountains they would not go, areas that felt wrong in ways they could not articulate. They described a sense of presence in certain hollows, a feeling that the forest was watching, that invisible boundaries existed, and crossing them would bring consequences. These were not superstitious people, not by their own reckoning. They were practical individuals who had spent their lives in the mountains. Their refusal came not from belief in folklore, but from direct experience, from having felt something that convinced them certain areas were best avoided. Fiona eventually abandoned her investigation. She wrote an article that touched on the Vesper story, but framed it as an example of how isolation could create insular belief systems, how communities cut off from mainstream society could develop their own realities. The article was published in a regional magazine and largely forgotten. She never went back to the mountains. In an interview years later, she admitted that the experience had unsettled her more than she wanted to acknowledge, that she still sometimes dreamed about walking through endless forest, searching for a settlement that was always just out of sight, just beyond the next ridge. The question remains, what was Vesper? Was it a real community that somehow vanished? Was it a shared delusion experienced by the research team? Or was it something else entirely, something that exists in the uncertain space between fact and fiction? Dr. Ashwood's theory about accumulated belief creating localized reality offers one explanation, but it is not satisfying. It does not account for the physical evidence, the recordings and photographs that exist, even though they are corrupted and ambiguous. It does not explain why multiple people, approaching from different perspectives with different backgrounds, would all describe the same sense of wrongness, the same feeling of being watched by something that should not exist. Perhaps the truth is that places like Vesper operate under different rules, that the mountains contain pockets where normal explanations break down, where the usual relationship between belief and reality is inverted. In most of the world, reality shapes belief. We observe what is, and we form beliefs based on those observations. But in certain isolated places, in regions where human presence is marginal and nature remains dominant, perhaps belief can shape reality. Perhaps the conviction that something exists, held strongly enough by enough people over enough time, can call that thing into being, can make it manifest in ways that have tangible effects. This is not a comforting thought. It suggests that the world is less stable than we assume, that there are places where consensus reality is fragile, where the collective consciousness of a community can alter the fundamental nature of their environment. It implies that isolation is dangerous, not just socially or economically, but ontologically, that cutting ourselves off from the larger world allows localized beliefs to become so concentrated that they achieve a kind of independent existence. And it raises the question of how many other communities exist in similar states, maintaining similar balances with presences that should not be real, but are real enough to shape behavior, to enforce rules, to exact consequences when those rules are broken. The Appalachian Mountains have never been fully mapped, never been completely explored. There are valleys that no satellite imagery has captured, hollows so deep and so remote that they might as well exist in another dimension. In these places, communities might persist according to logics that make no sense to outsiders, following patterns established generations ago and maintained through necessity rather than choice. They might coexist with things that cannot be explained, things that exist because belief in them is so fundamental to the community's survival that questioning their existence would be tantamount to self-destruction. And if you go into those mountains, if you hike far enough from maintained trails, if you push deep enough into the wilderness, you might find signs of these communities. A cleared patch of land where no clearing should be, smoke rising from a place where no one is supposed to live, figures moving between trees in ways that suggest deliberate concealment. Most people who encounter these signs turn back. The instinct to retreat, to leave unknown places unexplored is strong, But some people push forward, driven by curiosity or necessity, and those people sometimes disappear into the mountains and are never seen again. Are they lost in the ordinary sense, victims of accidents or exposure, or do they find something, stumble into one of these isolated communities, cross invisible boundaries that cannot be uncrossed? The authorities have no answers. Search and rescue teams cover vast areas, but the mountains always keep some secrets. Bodies are never found, or when they are found, they are in places that make no sense, positions that suggest the person was trying to reach something rather than trying to escape. The families of the missing eventually accept that the mountains have claimed another life, add their loved one's name to the long list of people who walked into the wilderness and never walked out. Dr. Ashwood's final journal entry, written shortly before his death, expressed a single thought that seemed to summarize his years of reflection on Vesper. He wrote that perhaps we are wrong to think of places like the Appalachian Mountains as empty wilderness, waiting to be explored and understood. Perhaps these places are full, crowded with things we cannot see, things that have always been there and will remain long after human presence has faded. Our maps and our certainty about what exists and what does not exist are comforting fictions, barriers we construct to keep ourselves from confronting the possibility that the world is stranger and more dangerous than we want to believe. And perhaps the people of Vesper, if they still exist somewhere in the high country, understand this better than anyone. They live with that strangeness every day, maintain their careful routines not out of superstition, but out of practical necessity, coexisting with something that academic language cannot capture and official reality refuses to acknowledge. They are not victims or prisoners or madmen. They are simply people who have accepted terms that the rest of us would find intolerable, who have made accommodations with something that refuses to be accommodated in any normal sense. The story of Vesper is not a story about monsters or supernatural entities. It is a story about the limits of human understanding, about what happens when we push into places that operate under rules we do not comprehend. It is a story about isolation and fear, and the strange things that can emerge when communities are cut off from the larger world for too long. And it is a story without an ending, because places like Vesper do not end. They simply continue, hidden in the folds of the landscape, maintained by people whose names we will never know, following patterns we will never understand, keeping arrangements with things that may or may not be there, but are real enough to shape every moment of their lives. If you find yourself in the Appalachian Mountains, in the high country where the trails fade and the trees grow dense, pay attention to the feeling in your gut. If something tells you to turn back, listen to that instinct. The mountains have been here longer than any human civilization, have witnessed things we cannot imagine, and they hold secrets that are best left undisturbed. Not because those secrets are supernatural, but because understanding them requires a kind of sacrifice, a willingness to accept that our grip on reality is much more tenuous than we like to think. And once that acceptance occurs, once you truly understand how fluid the boundary between belief and reality can become in isolated places, there is no going back to the comfortable certainty of the world you left behind.